Have you ever witnessed a humble farmer morph into a fearless warrior right before your eyes? In this story, you'll see exactly that, and it's nothing short of exhilarating. Imagine a quiet farm in Montana where life moves at a leisurely pace until one night a brazen group of criminals tries to set everything ablaze. Little did they know, the farmer they targeted once served as an elite sniper in special forces, and he's about to remind them that even the most unassuming land can become a fierce battleground. If you're curious how one man and his community turned the tables on a powerful cartel, stick around. You won't believe how it all ends. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to Farmer Story, where we share gripping tales of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable spirit found in everyday people. Join our growing family of story lovers and never miss a chance to be inspired. Stick with us. This is only the beginning. High in the rugged foothills of western Montana, a solitary figure named Ray Maxwell walked the perimeter of his 20-acre farm. At 57, Ray's face bore the etched lines of a man who had spent a lifetime wrestling with challenge after challenge, both on foreign soil and in the quiet sanctity of rural America. His hair was flecked with gray, his eyes steady and keen, like those of a hawk scanning the horizon for small movements in the grass. These eyes, once the hidden asset of the most elite Special Forces unit in the Army, now turned to more peaceful concerns: corn, chickens, water flow, and daily chores. But though Ray had chosen to live out his days as a farmer, he had not forgotten the hard lessons that made him who he was. A memory of distant battles still clung to him, invisible but unbreakable, like the smell of gun oil on a well-used rifle. Alongside him padded Brutus, his enormous German shepherd, the only companion from his past life that Ray would speak of openly. Trained in military tactics, Brutus was more partner than pet, a vigilant sentinel who shared Ray's cautious disposition. Together they had made this patch of land a sanctuary, a space that allowed Ray to shed the old camouflage and settle into a quieter rhythm. Yet he never let the routine lull him into complacency. Every day he made a full circuit, checking the boundaries, scanning for anything amiss. Some days he'd catch a neighbor's stray cow nudging at the fence. Other days, only the caw of ravens overhead told him that life was carrying on as it should. Montana's autumn air carried a slight bite that morning, the promise of an early winter drifting on the wind. Golden fields blended seamlessly with deep pine forests that stretched into mountainous terrain beyond. The old barn Ray had built by hand sat strong and solid near the southeast corner of his property. It sheltered farm equipment and feed, but it also held carefully hidden compartments stocked with remnants of Ray's past: tactical gear, firearms, and enough ammunition to remind him that some habits formed in war never fade entirely. Despite Ray's guarded ways, the locals viewed him as a kind of folk hero, or at least a friendly face at the weekend market selling organic produce that often outperformed that of many bigger operations around the county. Neighboring families would occasionally comment on how Ray's tomatoes always seemed a little bigger, his corn a bit sweeter. He chalked it up to hard work and good soil, though inwardly he knew that his training, attention to detail, discipline, endurance, bled into every row he planted. The result was a farm that thrived. He would have been content if life had remained that simple. But over the past few weeks, Ray had observed a pattern that reminded him too much of the old days. On more than one occasion, a dark SUV with tinted windows crawled down the gravel road alongside his property, pausing ever so slightly as if to stake out the land. The men inside never ventured out or exchanged words with him. They simply took in the surroundings and then rolled on. Rumors from the local feed store indicated an expanding threat. A cartel known as Las Manadas had begun purchasing or coercing ownership of remote properties throughout the region to build an illicit network. It wasn't long before Sheriff Christina Vega rang him up, a concerned note in her voice. She'd heard about suspicious incidents at a few nearby ranches: barns mysteriously torched, livestock stolen, farmers intimidated into selling for a fraction of their land's worth. It was classic strong-arm tactics, but more brutal. Ray responded calmly, acknowledging that he'd keep an eye out. He didn't want trouble, but he knew exactly how to handle it if trouble sought him. That evening, while Ray was finishing the final livestock checks, Brutus startled and ran toward the western edge of the property. The dog's sudden posture, ears forward, lips curled, was warning enough. Ray crouched behind a stack of hay bales, scanning the tree line through the dim evening light. At first he heard nothing but the usual nocturnal chorus of crickets and a distant owl. Then he caught the faint crunch of twigs and the rustle of boots on pine needles. Someone was out there creeping in, wearing the darkness like a shroud. His mind flashed back to a different place, a high-altitude plateau in Afghanistan where every slight shift of gravel could signal an imminent ambush. The memory was so visceral that he could almost smell the desert wind. Except this time, the setting was a Montana farm, and the infiltration was happening right in his backyard. Ray reached for the sidearm he always carried, an old, well-maintained pistol that had traveled with him through countless operations. Brutus's ears twitched. The dog's presence alone was a formidable deterrent, but Ray knew better than to rely on mere intimidation. Patience, he reminded himself, was the key. Let them reveal themselves. After several tense minutes, he glimpsed silhouettes moving around the perimeter. Their shape and posture suggested 3, maybe 4 individuals. They were quiet, methodical, professional. No stray flashlight beams, no clumsy movement. Whoever they were, they knew how to keep a low profile. The group reached the fence line near the barn but made no immediate move. Ray considered his options. Confront them, open fire, or wait. He decided on the third option. A phone buzz from inside his jacket suddenly broke the hush. Although muffled, it was enough for one of the silhouettes to pivot sharply in his direction. Ray held his breath, cursing the timing. The call was from his old friend Victor Robles, a private security consultant who had served with Ray back in the day. Ray had tipped him off about potential trouble weeks ago, but if he answered now, the noise would give away his position. He silenced the phone and slid it back into his pocket. Unable to remain hidden without giving up an advantageous vantage, Ray inched back into the shadows. Brutus stayed put, nose to the air. Moments later, Ray saw a brief flicker, like someone flipping open a lighter, followed by a slow whoosh of flame. A grim realization struck. They were starting a fire. Then came another flicker and a second whoosh. In seconds, the dry hay inside the barn erupted into a hungry blaze. The intruders had planned it out meticulously, splashing accelerants at multiple points. As the barn caught flame, the attackers retreated smoothly into the forest, their mission accomplished. Ray ground his teeth, fury flaring in his chest. The barn was the heart of his farm, built with his own sweat over many months. He had poured countless hours into ensuring it was well ventilated, well stocked, and now it was becoming an inferno. He sprinted toward the blaze with Brutus on his heels. But he knew the firefight was hopeless. It was too well planned. The barn was lost. Flames roared into the night sky, a beacon of destruction. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, the roof had already caved in. Embers drifted on the wind, scattering bits of Ray's hard work across the farmland. Sheriff Vega appeared, her face set in grim lines. She took in the scene, molten beams, twisted metal, animals fleeing from the area, and turned to Ray. "Looks like the stories we've heard aren't stories anymore," she said bitterly. "You all right?" Ray nodded, but his face was a mask of controlled anger. "I've been through worse, Sheriff," he replied, voice low and steady. "But I won't let this stand." The next day, Ray felt the aftertaste of the previous night's destruction as he stared at the smoldering wreckage. Stubborn wisps of smoke rose from the remains of blackened timbers. Some of his equipment had been saved. He'd managed to pull out one tractor and smaller tools. But the structure itself was gone. The lingering haze reminded him of a battlefield after the shelling had ceased, that eerie calm signifying both loss and resolve. He spent the early morning clearing debris where it was safe. Brutus occasionally sniffed the edges, letting out a faint growl as if the dog, too, sensed the violation of their home. Neighbors stopped by to offer condolences and to help. A few even brought supplies or homemade meals. Each gesture of kindness only deepened Ray's determination to make things right. When the local volunteer fire chief arrived to survey the aftermath, Ray noticed the suspicion etched into the man's features. "Probably arson," the chief said softly, kicking at a scorched plank. "Smells like accelerant." Ray nodded, wordlessly confirming what he already knew. Sheriff Vega's investigation would likely turn up footprints or tire tracks, but Ray doubted the culprits had left any sloppy evidence. They had worked with the deftness of professionals. Mid-morning, Ray stepped into what remained of a side shed to find the hidden compartment that housed his old gear. Miraculously, that section had sustained only minor damage, thanks to thick metal plating and the direction of the wind. He opened the compartment and quickly inventoried its contents. A well-maintained sniper rifle that had once earned him a fearsome reputation, several sidearms, specialized scopes, and boxes of custom ammunition. He hadn't handled them in ages, but his muscle memory was as sharp as ever. Before Ray left the shed, his phone vibrated again. This time he answered. Victor Robles was on the line, concerned and direct. Ray detailed the events of the previous night, how the barn had gone up in flames, likely courtesy of the Las Manadas cartel, who were rumored to be strong-arming local property owners. Victor offered to bring a team. I appreciate it, Ray replied, but for now I need to assess the situation. I'll let you know if I need the cavalry. Next he rang Enrique Suarez, a longtime friend and former teammate who now worked with the DEA. If anyone had intel on Las Manadas, it was Enrique. He didn't disappoint. They've been expanding operations beyond Idaho, Enrique explained. They're searching for routes in less patrolled regions. Montana's rural sprawl is a perfect network corridor. The man you might be dealing with is Diego Mendez, ex-Mexican Special Forces, known for stepping up cartel efficiency. Arson is just one of his tactics, intimidation without immediate mass violence until necessary. Ray let the name sink in. Diego Mendez, a professional who understood how to strike fear before pressing the advantage. If Mendez thought Ray was just some easygoing farmer, well, he was in for a rude awakening. Still, Ray knew better than to rush in blindly. He needed more intelligence, better understanding of Mendez's local network, and support from the neighbors who had as much stake in this fight as he did. In the afternoon, Ray called a few trusted folks in the area. Gail Summers, who'd served as a medic in the Army, John Talbot, an ex-Marine, and Oscar and Fiona Weller, a couple who both had backgrounds in logistics with the National Guard. Quietly, they had all been keeping tabs on the shady dealings in the region, suspecting that something was about to boil over. The barn burning was proof. If Las Manadas had the audacity to incinerate Ray's building, they could target any farm, any ranch, and eventually build a criminal pipeline right under everyone's noses. Gail was the first to arrive at Ray's farm. She stepped out of her pickup truck and whistled low at the wreckage. "You sure you're okay?" she asked, her concern genuine. "I'm managing," Ray replied, "but we need a plan. This won't stop with just one fire." Within an hour, the rest assembled around Ray's kitchen table, which now served as an impromptu war room. Brutus lay by the door, silent but vigilant. Gail spread out a large county map, marking potential infiltration routes and spots that had recently been purchased by suspicious shell companies. John pointed to certain roads leading from Idaho into Montana. They'd likely bring contraband this way, he theorized. Minimal highway patrol presence, lots of farmland, easy-to-hide shipments. Oscar Weller chimed in about the legitimate-looking companies that might serve as fronts. Fiona added that they'd seen black SUVs similar to the ones Ray described, cruising slowly by farms at night. A pattern was emerging. Meanwhile, Ray recalled his own training. How to organize defenses around a perimeter, how to coordinate angles of fire, how to set traps without risking innocent lives. "We have to approach this methodically," he said to the group. "They already took out my barn. Next, they'll try to intimidate other folks into selling. If that fails, they'll move to heavier violence." Sheriff Vega joined them partway through. She had already made it clear she was sympathetic, but legal constraints often tied her hands. Local law enforcement was ill-equipped to handle a well-armed cartel. She nodded at the map. "The county commissioners are pressuring me to keep a lid on things, but we all know that's not how to solve this. If you have to defend yourselves, do it smart. I can't promise official backup, but I can make sure no one ties you up in red tape." The plan they hashed out involved multiple layers of defense. Ray's place would serve as a primary point for confrontation, partly because Mendez's crew seemed fixated on it after the barn fire, and partly because Ray's land offered various vantage points that he'd spent years studying. The Weller property, located 2 miles north, would serve as an observation post. Gail's and John's properties, each west and east respectively, could provide flanking positions if Las Manadas attempted a second strike. They all agreed on establishing secure communication channels, shortwave radios, coded signals, and discrete phone apps. Once the planning session ended, the group dispersed, each tasked with fortifying their own land and spreading quiet word to other neighbors who might be targets. Ray walked them to their cars, gratitude tempered by steely resolve. This was bigger than one farm, one barn, or one ex-sniper's personal grudge. It was about preserving a way of life and ensuring that brazen criminals couldn't plant roots in a community that valued its autonomy. Early the next morning, the entire valley was cloaked in fog, a thick blanket that softened the edges of mountains and farmland. Ray used the cover to check vantage points around his property. With Brutus at his side, he identified natural choke points along the roads and places where he could establish concealed firing positions. Yes, it felt surreal to plan such maneuvers on American soil, but he'd done this before in countless operations overseas. This time, the battlefield was the quiet farmland he'd sworn to protect. Using a small handheld device, he placed motion sensors in strategic locations. These sensors had been part of his old kit, collecting dust until now. Modified to run on solar power with battery backup, they would alert Ray and his allies of any unusual approach. He also positioned a few well-hidden trail cameras, the kind hunters use to monitor deer populations. But these were angled and disguised so that any passerby would dismiss them as typical hunting gear. He took note of the terrain. The eastern slope provided a rise that granted a clear line of sight over most of the farmland. The north was dense with trees, an ideal place for stealth. Over the years, Ray had become intimately familiar with each ridge and trough. While it pained him to turn his beloved farmland into a potential battleground, he saw no alternative. Midday, he received a call from General Alvin Wu, his former commanding officer, and the man who once oversaw a series of missions that earned Ray the moniker Phantom Marksman. General Wu had heard from mutual contacts that Ray's situation was precarious. He cut to the chase. "You need support, Ray? I can pull a few strings, get you some unmarked assets if things get too hot." "Sorry?" Ray appreciated the offer, but he hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to drag formal military assistance onto private land, risking red tape or public controversy. "I'll keep you posted," Ray answered, "but I've got a good local team forming here. We'll handle it." Wu didn't push the issue. He knew Ray's capacity to orchestrate a plan, especially when the cause was personal. By late afternoon, the sun burned away the fog, revealing a sky so clear it seemed to stretch into forever. Ray spotted another black SUV rolling slowly along the gravel road. This time he didn't hide. He stood openly near the fence, his posture balanced between welcome and warning. The SUV slowed, tinted windows revealing nothing. Then it continued driving. Dust kicked up in its wake. Ray exhaled. The message had been delivered. He was watching. Inside the house, the phone rang again. Enrique Suarez with updates from the DEA's end. "I've been working angles on these guys," Enrique said. "Las Manadas is structured but not inflexible. Mendez leads with intimidation, tests responses, and escalates quickly. Watch out for nighttime sabotage, infiltration tactics, anything that can break morale. They'll burn, kidnap, or threaten, whatever fits the moment." Ray almost laughed grimly. He knew those tactics too well. "We're preparing. Let me know if you find anything else." After hanging up, he started examining his sniper rifle, running a clean cloth along its barrel. The weapon felt reassuring, a tangible link to the set of skills he thought he'd retired. He had no desire to pull the trigger on fellow human beings again, but if forced, he wouldn't hesitate. Night fell like a veil. Ray had set up a makeshift command center in what was left of the barn's foundation, a small, secure area not easily visible from the outside. A portable generator hummed, powering monitors connected to the trail cameras and motion sensors. The rest of the group checked in periodically. Gale was monitoring local emergency channels. John was working on more robust barricades for the roads leading into his ranch. The Wellers tested their new shortwave radios, ensuring they'd remain linked even if cell signals were jammed. Around midnight, the sensors flagged movement near the southern edge of Ray's property. On the monitors, he saw 3 silhouettes trying to sneak in, much like the earlier group that had torched the barn. This time, however, Ray was better prepared. Moving swiftly and silently, he took up position at a hidden vantage point. Brutus stayed at his side, trained to respond to subtle hand signals. The intruders advanced cautiously. Their gear suggested some level of ex-military training, well-fitted ballistic vests, night vision goggles, and suppressed firearms. One signaled the others to pause. They scanned the open ground as if expecting immediate resistance. They were indeed professionals, but so was Ray. He waited for them to cross the invisible boundary he had set, a line of discrete tripwires connected to flashbang rigs. Once the lead intruder tripped it, the device launched a sudden burst of light and sound, disorienting them. In that split second of chaos, Ray aimed and fired a warning shot that struck the dirt near the men's feet. He wanted to show them that they were pinned down without necessarily killing them on sight. The intruders dove behind a low embankment. One frantically motioned for the others to regroup. Ray keyed his radio. "John, do you see them?" he whispered. A crackle returned. "Got eyes from the east. Should I engage?" Ray hesitated. He didn't want to escalate unless necessary. "Hold, let's see if they retreat." But the intruders regrouped and fired a few rounds blindly in Ray's general direction, muzzle flashes sparking in the darkness. Bullets whizzed past, tearing into wooden posts. Ray took a measured breath, exhaled, and sent a single shot through the night. It punched into the bank just centimeters from one attacker's torso. The man jolted back, and Ray could almost sense the fear crossing their minds. "We're dealing with a sniper." After a tense few seconds, the group began a hasty withdrawal, covering each other as they fled back over the fence. Ray didn't pursue. Let them go and report back, he thought. Let them tell their boss that this farmland wasn't an easy conquest. By the time dawn began to lighten the horizon, Ray had checked the perimeter for damage. Only a few bullet holes in fence posts. No casualties on either side. He realized this was just the opening skirmish. Diego Mendez and his crew wouldn't simply walk away. They'd recalibrate, come back in force, or try a subtler approach. But Ray had sent a message. The quiet homesteader they'd expected had teeth, and he wasn't afraid to use them. News of the nighttime skirmish spread quickly among the farms that had allied themselves in recent days. Word of mouth and discreet phone calls kept the community connected without drawing public attention from those who might compromise their efforts or label them vigilantes. In each conversation, the gist was the same. The cartel had tested Ray Maxwell's defenses and found them too formidable for a casual takeover. But it also meant bigger moves were imminent. Over the next couple of days, Ray fortified his property further. He used simple yet effective tools, reinforced gates, additional lighting that could be turned on at a moment's notice, and carefully placed caltrops that would shred the tires of any unauthorized vehicle crossing his fields. Others in the network followed suit, some setting up decoy structures that appeared vulnerable while real valuables were stashed elsewhere. A sense of collective determination took root, knitting them closer together. On the law enforcement side, Sheriff Vega did what she could within the confines of her job. She filed reports, noted suspicious activity, and quietly warned families who might be at risk. The local government officials, however, seemed to prefer keeping their heads in the sand, not wanting to ignite panic or a political headache. The result was a tacit acceptance that the farmers would handle their security, at least for the time being. During a routine check of the south pasture, Ray heard the low hum of an engine. Pulling out his binoculars, he spotted a gleaming white SUV approaching along the gravel road. It parked near the house, the engine idling. The driver stepped out, Diego Mendez himself, wearing an impeccably tailored suit that clashed sharply with the rural backdrop. He was flanked by two men in tactical clothing, their eyes scanning the yard like hawks. Ray approached cautiously, stopping a few yards from Mendez. Brutus remained at Ray's side, silent but ready. Mendez's posture radiated confidence. "Senor Maxwell," he greeted in lightly accented English, "I regret the unfortunate incidents around here, but maybe we can talk." His voice was smooth, cultured. Ray kept his expression neutral. "I'm not one for small talk. State your business." "Great." One of Mendez's men scoffed, resting a hand near his concealed weapon. Mendez held up a dismissive hand. "We can settle this with minimal fuss," he said calmly. "A farm like this, what is it really worth? My associates and I can offer a generous price, far above market value, in fact." He extended an envelope, presumably stuffed with cash or a signed bank draft. Ray didn't even glance at it. Not selling, he said. His tone was as unyielding as the rocky soil under his boots. Take your envelope and your threats elsewhere. Mendez's composure didn't crack, but his voice grew colder. Suit yourself, but understand this. You're making a choice that could cost you everything. I'd prefer an amicable deal. Destruction is such a waste. Ray's eyes narrowed. You've already destroyed one barn. If you think I'll roll over now, you misunderstand me. For a moment, the tension grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Mendez gave a curt nod. Until next time, Senor Maxwell. He flicked his gaze to Brutus. And do keep that dog under control. With that, he turned and climbed back into the SUV, which rumbled away in a swirl of dust. Shortly after Mendez's departure, Ray convened a strategy meeting with the neighbors who formed the backbone of their ad hoc defense alliance. They gathered in the Weller family's spacious barn, the one that served as a vantage point for the northern road. Fiona Weller had pinned a detailed county map to the wall, marking the location of recent suspicious sightings with colored pushpins. John Talbot tapped the map. So Mendez made the generous offer move, huh? Classic. They'll next try to isolate you, Ray, maybe by scaring away your supporters. Ray nodded. And that means we have to stick close to one another. None of us can handle them alone, but together we stand a chance. They discussed how to enhance security for each property, an expanded version of the perimeter system Ray had set up. The plan was to create overlapping fields of surveillance and, if necessary, lines of fire. They also considered non-lethal measures, such as flashbang traps and sonic alarms, to disorient intruders. The last thing they wanted was a bloodbath, but they would not shy away from defending their land. Sheriff Vega joined them, quietly stepping in while John was explaining a new drone system he'd acquired. The drone carried a camera that could transmit live video feed up to several miles. It wasn't advanced military hardware, but it was enough to keep watch over large swaths of land without risking a person's safety. Vega offered a faint smile. I'm supposed to be telling you all to stand down and let the authorities handle this. But we both know the legal system moves too slowly to stop Mendez's aggression. Just be careful. Ray assured her that their aim was deterrence, not vigilantism. If the cartel escalated to lethal force, the group would respond accordingly, but only to protect themselves and their neighbors. Vega seemed to accept that, then returned to the station to file another round of official notices about unidentified trespassers. As the meeting wrapped up, they agreed on a system of coded text messages to quickly signal if an attack was in progress. Each farm would also have designated safe zones, areas where family members could hide if things turned ugly. Though many in these families were ex-military, there were also children, grandparents, and others who simply wanted to live a peaceful life without gunfire echoing through the hills. At dusk, Ray returned to his property. He stood at the edge of the burned barn's remains, mentally reviewing the new security measures. He recalled Mendez's parting words about destruction being a waste. Deep down, Ray knew Mendez saw this standoff as a game of chess, an opportunity to exhibit control and expand territory with minimal casualties. But Ray also knew how to play that game. He remembered endless nights in foreign deserts or mountain passes, waiting for the perfect shot that would dismantle an entire enemy cell. Here, he wasn't merely a hired gun. This was his home, his sense of belonging. He ruffled Brutus's fur and stared at the sky. The moon was rising, bright and pale. He wondered if Mendez was out there plotting the next move. Well, let him plot. Ray would be ready. 2 nights later, the cartel launched a more concerted attack. Multiple SUVs, headlights off, approached Ray's farm from different directions. Each carried armed men who understood stealth and coordination. The watchers in the adjacent properties sent frantic alerts through shortwave radio. Movement on the North Road. Another SUV spotted near the old orchard to the south. Ray, stationed in his hidden command post, split his gaze between 2 monitors. On one screen, a feed from John Talbot's drone showed 3 vehicles maneuvering near a shallow creek bed, likely trying to flank the farm from behind. On the other, footage from a camera concealed in an oak tree revealed men setting up near the destroyed barn's perimeter. The cartel had learned from their previous mistakes. They used cover better, moved in squads of 4 to 6 men, and tried to jam certain radio frequencies. However, the defenders had anticipated such tactics. Tom Weller had boosted their communications array with directional antennas capable of cutting through standard jamming signals. Within minutes, the firefight began. Cartel operatives at the barn perimeter triggered an alarm rig. Bright spotlights snapped on, flooding the area and rendering their night vision gear useless. Disoriented, several men fired wildly. Ray coolly took aim with his sniper rifle from a high ridge he'd scouted earlier. He picked off the radio pack on one of the intruders, cutting them off from their command. Another shot punctured a SUV's radiator, forcing the men inside to scramble for cover. From the east side, John's vantage revealed a second group trying to cross open ground. He relayed coordinates to Gail Summers, who was positioned with a rifle and night vision scope. She let off warning shots that forced the attackers to drop and flatten themselves in the grass. Meanwhile, Fiona Weller launched the drone overhead, its camera capturing real-time data on group movements, which she fed to Ray's command center. Though outnumbered, the defenders had the advantage of preparation, home ground familiarity, and disciplined coordination. The cartel squads found themselves stymied at every turn, flanked by crossfire, stalled by booby traps, or lit up by sudden spotlights that destroyed their tactical advantage. Rather than mounting a unified offensive, they were reduced to scattered pockets of men trying to regroup while bullets kicked up dirt around them. In the chaos, Ray scanned for a sign of Mendez. He doubted the cartel leader would expose himself directly, but if he did, Ray intended to make sure the man thought twice about stepping on Montana soil. In a fleeting moment, through a thermal scope, Ray identified a figure standing near one of the vehicles, barking orders into a phone. The stance matched Mendez's known height and build. Without hesitation, Ray squeezed the trigger, aiming for the vehicle's side mirror. The bullet shattered it, sending shards of glass ricocheting. Mendez dove for cover, and the phone clattered to the ground. Less than 20 minutes after the assault began, the cartel's organized plan had collapsed. Small groups of Mendez's men broke off, calling frantically for extraction vehicles. But each route out was compromised. Spikes on the roads, surveillance from neighboring properties, and well-timed rifle shots pinned them down. Finally, as the defenders closed in, the cartel men abandoned equipment and retreated on foot into the forest. The aftermath of the battle was almost surreal. Ray and his neighbors moved cautiously among the scattered vehicles, verifying that no immediate threats remained. Sheriff Vega and a handful of deputies arrived, lights flashing. They found bullet-riddled SUVs, weapons discarded in haste, and a handful of wounded cartel operatives who had been left behind, groaning under the glare of the cruiser headlights. Vega took statements from the defenders, but there was no question who had initiated the attack. Despite the evidence, Ray knew the judicial system would require more airtight legal cases, which often meant months of investigations, warrants, and cross-state collaboration. The pressing matter now was the wounded men. Gail Summers quickly reverted to her medic training, stabilizing 2 men with serious injuries before the ambulance arrived. Ray held conflicting emotions about that. The men were the enemy, but letting them die would betray the principles he and his neighbors stood for. DEA agent Enrique Suarez showed up not long after, stepping out of an unmarked sedan. He and Vega conferred briefly over the detainees. Though battered and disoriented, the captured men clammed up, unwilling to provide information on Mendez or their larger network. Ray suspected they had strict orders. No squealing under any circumstances. As dawn approached, the reality set in. Victory belonged to the locals that night, but the war wasn't over. Now the cartel would likely escalate. Mendez wouldn't accept humiliation without a lethal response. Ray braced himself for the next phase. Within hours, local media picked up the story of a violent farm invasion, though details were scant. Many in the valley, roused by the commotion, came to see the aftermath. Some expressed awe that a small cluster of farmers and ranchers could repel a force of seasoned criminals. Others worried about reprisal, their eyes darting nervously to the horizon as if expecting men in black SUVs to reappear. Ray convened a brief meeting with the core group, John, Gail, the Wellers, and a few other trusted neighbors. "We won't chase them down," Ray said firmly. "We protect our land, our people. If they come again, we repeat the strategy. Stay defensive, keep communication lines open, and hold strong." But inside, Ray felt a growing urgency. The cartel had shown they were willing to engage in open combat. What if they started targeting families, or unleashed sabotage that didn't rely on direct confrontation, poisoning water supplies or setting more fires? They needed to anticipate every trick. He pulled Enrique aside. You said Mendez was a professional with ex-military training. He'll regroup, maybe bring in heavier weapons, or try infiltration again. Any suggestions? Enrique pursed his lips. Mendez was known for psychological warfare back when he was with certain special forces in Mexico. He won't just outmuscle you. He'll try to fracture your alliances from within, or strike your morale in ways you don't expect. Keep everyone tight. The moment your group shows internal doubt or conflict, he'll exploit it. Ray pondered those words, remembering how vital unity had been in the fields of Afghanistan, how a single doubt could derail an entire operation. We'll hold together, he said. We have to. Over the next week, the valley teetered on a knife's edge. Sheriff Vega discreetly beefed up patrols, but her resources were limited. The local government, still reluctant to escalate matters officially, offered no additional support. Meanwhile, chatter at the feed store and the gas station hinted that some families were considering selling out and moving, fearful they'd be the next targets of violence. Ray couldn't blame them for feeling that way. To counter Mendez's potential psychological gambits, the farmers bolstered their sense of community. They organized potlucks at the local church, encouraged neighbors to attend self-defense workshops, and formed committees to check on the elderly or those living in more remote stretches. Ray felt a swell of pride seeing ranchers, teachers, local shop owners, and even teenagers step up to build a network of watchfulness. It reminded him of how, in war zones, civilians would sometimes rally around a common cause, forging bonds stronger than any uniform or rank. But Ray also noticed a subtle tension creeping in. Whispers circulated about whether they should rely so heavily on vigilante tactics. Some believed the stand against the cartel might only provoke deadlier reprisals. Others trusted Ray's judgment, knowing his background. Most recognized that waiting passively could lead to being overrun. Still, the seeds of doubt were precisely what Mendez wanted. One evening, after a long day of fence repairs and reorganizing equipment, Ray sat on his porch with Brutus at his feet. He watched the sun dip below the mountains, bathing the horizon in a swirl of pink and orange. In that peaceful moment, he could almost forget there were criminals plotting in the darkness. Then his phone buzzed. Another update from Enrique. The DEA had intercepted communications suggesting that Mendez was planning a major push soon. The details were vague, but it involved out-of-state reinforcements, maybe a large convoy. Ray's stomach nodded. If that was true, they could face an unprecedented assault. The small, well-armed squads they'd been dealing with might suddenly look like a mere scouting party. He immediately called a community meeting for the next night. At that gathering, he laid out the intel. Mendez might be rallying a big strike team to retake control. Gail's face went pale. How are we supposed to handle larger numbers? John rubbed his jaw. We fortify further. Better coordinated watch rotations. More fallback positions. Tom Weller mentioned possibly contacting national militias, but Ray shut that down, not wanting unauthorized militants swarming the valley and turning it into a war zone. Instead, they decided to refine their current approach. Advanced warning systems, layered defenses, and a concerted evacuation plan for non-combatants. Our advantage is we know the land, Ray reminded them. We can channel them, divide them, and pick them off if needed, but hopefully they'll see it's too costly to push further. All agreed to brace themselves. Some boarded up windows, stashed valuables, or moved livestock to safer locations. The overall mood was a strange blend of determination and dread, like farmers anticipating a raging storm on the horizon, except the storm carried guns, bulletproof vests, and an iron will to dominate the territory. The warnings turned real on a clear, star-filled night when watchers along the main routes spotted an incoming convoy. At least 6 SUVs, possibly more in the distance, rolling in tight formation with their headlights dark. The watchers relayed a coded message, Black Moon, across shortwave radios and encrypted phones. That was the signal for every prepared household to lock down and ready for conflict. Ray was back in his command post, armed with a new set of monitors that displayed live drone feeds and sensor data from across the valley. The tension was palpable. Children were huddled in basements, older folks sheltered at the local church, and the physically able stood at their property lines, firearms in hand, hearts pounding. Within minutes, the convoy split into 2 groups. The first moved along the northern approach near the Weller property. The second angled south, closer to Gale's homestead. This was an organized pincer movement aiming to corner Ray's farm from two sides, but the defenders had predicted such a maneuver and adapted accordingly. Fiona Weller launched the drone high enough to avoid detection, while Tom relayed the coordinates of the northern convoy. John Talbot was stationed on a hill to provide sniper cover. His first shot disabled the lead SUV's engine, stopping it dead in its tracks. Under fire, the men inside scrambled out, returning suppressive fire. Soon, muzzle flashes lit the darkness like distant fireflies. On the southern flank, Gale had set up tripwire alarms and floodlights hidden among hay bales. The moment the second convoy tried to advance, the area lit up as bright as day, throwing them into disarray. Then well-coordinated rifle shots from Ray's allies forced them to scatter for cover. Ray himself was in a concealed spot overlooking a broad stretch of field. Through the scope of his sniper rifle, he could see the orchestrations of Mendez's men, each taking up positions behind trees, rocks, or vehicles. One by one, Ray targeted their vehicles' critical components: tires, engines, radiators, anything to strand them. The attackers couldn't mount a mobile assault if their rides were rendered useless. After disabling a third SUV, Ray switched to thermal imaging, searching for Mendez. Through the ghostly whites and grays, he detected a figure wearing a distinctive ballistic vest with a patch on the back. Likely the commander. He leveled his sights, but the figure ducked behind a cinder block shed before Ray could get a clean shot. Chaos soon blanketed the valley. The defenders, fewer in number, used the terrain and their well-rehearsed strategy to compensate. The cartel fighters, numbering over 24, were more heavily armed, but increasingly bogged down by confusion and hindered by jamming of their comm signals. Meanwhile, the local defenders maintained their own secure lines with short-range radios that cut through interference. An unexpected flash erupted to Ray's right, a rocket-propelled grenade, launched at one of John's vantage points. The explosion tore through a wooden watchtower, collapsing it. Ray's heart lurched. He prayed John had escaped in time. Moments later, John's voice crackled over the radio, breathless but alive. "I'm okay. Moved just before they hit. But they're packing serious hardware." The sudden introduction of heavier firepower shifted the balance. Mendez's men spread out, using the rocket launcher to target defensive positions. Another explosion echoed through the night, shaking the ground beneath Ray's boots. Gale frantically radioed that she was pinned down near her barn, the walls rattling from near misses. That's when the rest of Ray's strategic brilliance came into play. He had stored a handful of specialized drones, courtesy of a friend in a security firm, to deliver distraction payloads. Nothing lethal, just flashbang grenades that could be dropped from above to sow chaos. Tom Weller unleashed them now. As each drone swooped over the cartel's positions, bright flashes and thunderous bangs sent men diving, ears ringing and vision blurred. Freed from the immediate rocket threat, Ray returned his focus to the sniper rifle. The confusion created by the drones gave him clearer opportunities. He neutralized the man carrying the rocket launcher, aiming for the shoulder to force him to drop the weapon. Then another shot severed the line of the second launcher, rendering it useless. In the midst of the battlefield cacophony, the sheriff's department arrived. Vega had managed to coordinate with a nearby county, bringing in additional deputies and unmarked vehicles. They set up roadblocks to trap the convoy. Some of the cartel men tried to break through with stolen pickup trucks, but spikes laid out by the defenders shredded their tires. Police vehicles pinned them in, lights flashing in eerie red and blue strobe across the rural darkness. Seeing their routes of escape closing, many cartel operatives attempted to scatter into the woods. But local volunteers, each stationed at key junctions, blocked the way. Spotlights glared, rifles aimed. Over loudspeakers, the sheriff demanded they surrender. Simultaneously, Mendez tried to rally his troops. He barked orders in Spanish, calling for a final push. Through his scope, Ray watched Mendez pace beside a half-disabled SUV, phone in hand, probably yelling for more backup. Another flashbang drone soared overhead, dropping its payload. Mendez ducked, covering his head. Ray seized the moment and fired. The bullet pierced the SUV's door, inches from Mendez's leg. It was another warning, a sign that continuing would only cost him dearly. At last, the cartel squads realized they were outmaneuvered. One by one, they began surrendering, laying down arms when confronted by the combined presence of armed locals and the sheriff's deputies. While some fled into the wilderness, The core group was pinned with no path forward or back. The once arrogant infiltration had turned into a fiasco. When it was over, the sun was just creeping over the eastern horizon. Smoke drifted from a few smoldering vehicles, the air thick with the acrid stench of cordite. Casualties, surprisingly, were minimal, mostly injuries on the cartel side, with a handful of defenders nursing wounds from debris and stray bullets. Ray and the others moved wearily among the arrested or wounded cartel fighters, ensuring no further threat lingered. Brutus padded through the debris, occasionally sniffing at an abandoned rifle. In the muted light of dawn, Sheriff Vega walked up to Ray.